All right, Matt. We represented today.
Absolutely.
So you're not from Utah.
Unfortunately, one of my many flaws.
You've got Matt's the most difficult thing about Matt, maybe the only thing that's difficult about Matt is he has a very strict 8-hour rule.
It's true.
If I try to call him and he's got an appointment in 8 hours, it ain't happening. If I try to get him to stay up all night, it ain't happening.
It's happening as long as I can sleep 8 hours at the end of it.
8 hours after.
Yeah.
But Matt, you've been involved in some insane, I mean, I got your bio here. I think I already mentioned it, but whether it's you've been involved with Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, Uber, Snapchat. Those are the big brand ones, consumer brands, right? And then Tinder. Do you ever, when you were single, did you ever
I did use Tinder when I was single.
Did you ever finagle the?
No, you can't, you
Okay.
got to understand the product, and in order to do that, you just have to use the product.
So yeah, give us some insights. I mean, what stories you thought? What's I guess one of the big questions and big reasons why we're excited to have people from outside the state come in as well is, how do these epic companies get built? What's the commonality? You've seen it, you picked them. So what things are you seeing and sensing? How do we get a company like that? How can we learn from these?
Well, first of all, I think Utah has companies like that, and it's going to have a lot more companies like that. I love coming out here. I think the community here and the energy here is really incredible. All those companies, they are amazing, incredible, world-changing companies, but they weren't when they started. None of them were when they started. They were just these little things with these, people were kind of making it up as they went along and figuring it out as they went along and making a bunch of mistakes and getting some things right and getting really lucky on the timing and having some good judgment. I do think there's some common patterns in these companies. And, I guess I could really reduce it to three things. One is just an incredible, extraordinary, exceptional entrepreneur. And I can talk a little bit more about that. Secondly, a product model or a business model which can come into a market and somehow reshape and grow that market in a way that ultimately leaves the company in a position of real competitive strength in that market. And then lastly, some kind of sharp angle of attack into that market at the beginning. Because, when you're a little startup, and I'm sure a lot of people in the room here can relate to this, you can't fight Goliath head on. You just can't do it. You've got to find some way to sneak in from underneath or from the side. And there's a lot of different ways you can do that. You can do that through a product innovation. You can do that through a go-to-market innovation, a sales and marketing innovation. But you've got to find some kind of corner that you can sneak up on it through. Put yourself into some position of strength and then grow from there. So, to be more concrete, I think looking back historically, people all now know the story, but in the case of the Facebook, that was starting with initially just Ivy League, well, initially just Harvard undergrads, but then initially just Ivy League colleges in the US and colleges in the US, and ignoring the whole rest of the world and just staying ruthlessly focused on that market until we won it, and then growing from there. I think in the case of Snapchat, you had initially this product which had this incredible innovation around the idea of ephemerality, which was kind of, again, an initial angle of attack in the market. And of course, it's grown tremendously from there. In the case of Instagram, I think it was a combination of having this thing which at the time was just a transformatively great product experience in terms of being a mobile photo sharing app, combined with a really incredible kind of distribution strategy of using Facebook as a means of distribution for this other product, which was a lot easier to do then than it is today. So, you can do it through product, you can do it through sales and marketing, but you got to find some kind of sharp wedge to drive into the market through some point of vulnerability, and then you can grow from there once you're in a position of strength from there. But I think those things combined with a really exceptional entrepreneur are kind of the common patterns across all these different companies. I think it's true with SaaS companies too, by the way.
So what did you see at Uber? What did you see that captured your imagination there?
So my partners and I are hopefully self-aware enough to know that we don't have crystal balls. We can't see the future. we're not really product pickers or sector pickers, because what do we know? You know, we look for attributes in people and in products and in businesses. That being said, I kind of had this idea that I'd had in my head for a while, which came through actually initially the Sonos app on the iPhone. I remember when I got the Sonos app on the iPhone, I first used it, I was like, huh, this has like literally turned my iPhone into a remote control, because that's what the Sonos app does. And I thought about that and was like, you know, these smartphones, they're actually kind of like remote controls for real life. It's like you take this thing out of your pocket, you point it somewhere, you push a button, and something magical happens. Like that's the magic of a smartphone. So I started to like think about this idea of smartphones as being remote controls for real life, and was kind of like poking around looking for products and companies that were speaking to that. And I was lucky to be living in San Francisco, which for anyone who's ever been there can confirm has like the worst taxi market on the planet. Prior to Uber, it's probably even worse now actually, but prior to Uber, it's interesting what's happened to the taxi market since Uber, but that's a whole other conversation. So here's an interesting stat. So if you called, and by the way, in San Francisco, you can never flag down a taxi. There's like 0 chance of that.
Well, especially when it was raining.
Yeah, I mean, even more so when it's raining, but like, no matter what you do, you can't flag down a taxi. On a Friday night in San Francisco, if you called for a taxi cab prior to Uber, the chances, this was studied, some academics studied this, the chances that the cab would actually show up when you called and said, I'm at this location, here's my credit card, come pick me up, 20%. So like, that's just a busted market. So, you know, the conditions were right in San Francisco for Uber to start. And I happened to be living in San Francisco. I was driving around a lot because that's what you had to do. And, you know, I was just an early user of the product. And using the product, I just felt like, wow, this is one of these things, more than anything I've ever seen, which really is speaking to this idea of being like a remote control for real life. You pick your phone up out of your pocket, you press a button, a car comes, picks you up, drops you off. It's kind of this magical thing. And it happened to be just right for San Francisco. And in Travis, it happened to have exactly the right entrepreneur for that business. You know, I think people talk a lot about this idea of product market fit, which is one of these phrases which like I've never totally understood. It's kind of like a tautology. It's like, it means like it works, right? Like, yeah, okay, great. So like all you have to do is find product market fit. It's like all you have to do is make something that works. Like, great, that's helpful. But so, to the extent that there's any reality to this idea of, or anything useful to this idea of product market fit, I think there's also, you know, another important theme, or concept rather, of kind of like entrepreneur company fit, you know. And I think this is true for execs and you know, individual contributors and operators in the companies too, by the way. Context is everything, you know, and it's magic happens when you get the right person with the right personality and the right strengths and the right abilities, and a situation where that person's flaws and deficiencies don't matter very much. We've all got tons of flaws and deficiencies. If you find, you know, someone who's got the right strengths for the situation, that's where magic can really happen. You can capture lightning in a bottle. And I think Travis is very much that person for Uber. By the way, you know, as an aside, one of the many things that I've learned through making a lot of mistakes, working with a lot of companies over the years, is that really, you know, I think you can apply that to team building too. I'm a really deep believer in doing reference checks on every single employee that joins a company, particularly background, you know, off the record reference checks. But you always have to put it in context. You know, somebody can be wildly successful in one environment because of what that environment was and how their strengths play to that environment, and not be successful in a different environment. And I think that's true too for entrepreneurs. And you know, a lot of the greatest entrepreneurs, you know, wouldn't be successful working for anybody else. But in the environment that they're in, it's the right kind of a product model and a business model and a culture and a dynamic and a situation and time for them to be really successful. I think that was absolutely true for Kevin and Mike at Instagram, and absolutely true for Evan at Snapchat, absolutely true for Reed at LinkedIn, and true for Mark at Facebook, et cetera. So that's like always.
Are you saying there's some of those guys that had bad references, but the content?
Well, a lot of those guys had no references because they never had a job before.
Sure.
So, you know, you could like ask their high school teacher or something, you know, and they'd say, oh yeah, they were punks, because they usually were punks. So they often didn't have any references, and when they did, they didn't always have great references, actually. A couple of the very best entrepreneurs I've had the privilege of working with had worked for other people at other companies before, and I did talk to some of the people who had been their managers and their coworkers at those companies, and basically I can summarize the feedback with stay the F away from that person. It's like, all right, duly noted, I will not hire that person to be a senior director of sales operations. But as an entrepreneur, it's just a fundamentally different thing.
They break some glass.
They gotta break some glass, yeah.
So this is going on during Sundance. Facebook's been well documented with the movie.
Yeah.
Was one of the first questions I asked you after I saw it. Tell everybody how accurate or inaccurate it was. You were there for all of that.
Yeah, so, first of all, it's a great movie. Anybody who hasn't seen it, as a movie, as a piece of art, I highly, highly recommend it. As a work of history, I do not. But as a piece of art, I do. One of the things I try to remind myself all the time, because it's an easy trap to fall into, is to not confuse precision for accuracy. And I think that movie actually is like a really good example of being incredibly precise and wildly inaccurate. If you look at the movie, like every T-shirt that Mark wears in that movie, he has that T-shirt, like literally every single one. And there's like a hole on one of the T-shirts being washed too many times. Like, yeah, I know, I remember that hole. So they clearly took photographs from real life and studied them meticulously, and just on the surface painted this meticulously precise picture of the people, although not the office. The office was way fancier than the actual offices. But that's to me, that's like Hollywood's imagining of what the world perceives to be the glamour of startups, which a lot of people in this room know. It ain't as glamorous as it might seem. So there was a lot of correct detail, and they totally missed the point on the characters of the people involved and kind of the arc and shape and development of those people. But that's okay, because I don't think that they were trying to create a work of history. I had the opportunity to talk to the folks who were making the movie when they got started, because we were trying to figure out, what's this going to be exactly. And they made it very clear that they weren't trying to create a work of history. And Scott Rudin, who was the producer, talked about this movie, The Queen. I don't know if people have seen that. Anyone who hasn't seen that movie, that's also a really incredible work of art. Highly recommend it. And he said, he was the producer of both movies, he said, we're kind of working with the same idea here, which is there's these moments in time which were known to have happened as factual moments in time. And we're going to use those as our anchors. And everything else along the way, we're just going to make it up. And we're not trying to create a piece of biography or history here. We're telling a story, and we're going to use these anchor points in time to help us craft and create a story. Apparently, the thing they were really fascinated with, although I don't think this came through in the movie, was the idea of Harvard University, and the idea that this thing in American culture, which has this really important place in American culture, had never really been told as a story on film, and that was kind of a lot of the initial motivation, although I didn't think that came through very, very clearly in the movie. But highly recommend you see it if you haven't seen it.
So with you've been involved in an insane number of amazing companies. There's got to be some good stories about getting into those companies. Highly competitive. That's what VCs are built for, is closing the deal at the beginning. I've often heard you make all your money on the buy, not on the sell. And so getting into those deals, you got any good stories you can tell us about any of those?
A lot of good stories. Uber was really fun. So when the Uber Series A was happening, Travis was going around in an Uber to different venture offices. And because, why could we tell this? Okay, so it was early enough in the life of Uber that there just weren't a lot of Ubers available, particularly in Silicon Valley as opposed to in San Francisco. So today, Benchmark's main office is in San Francisco, which is a topic in and of itself we could talk about because there's been a real shift to the city. Back then, our main office was on Sand Hill Road in the Valley. We still have an office in Silicon Valley, but we spend most of our time in the city these days. Back then, VCs were spending most of their time on Sand Hill Road. There were not a lot of Ubers down in the Valley yet at that point. And so Travis came down in an Uber to do his meetings, and he would go to a meeting, end his Uber ride, and have the Uber stay there. And I guess you just tell the driver, I'm going to be going around for a while, just wait for me, I'll start new rides all the time. But he didn't keep it open. He just did new fares all the time. So as he was going around, we could see, we're like, this is the one Uber, this is Travis's Uber. We could see where he was going. And so as he was going into each venture office, like, oh, yeah, no, look at that, he's at Greylock now. Oh, yeah, no, he's at Sequoia. And so he's going around to all of these different venture offices, and we had this idea when he was at the meeting that he had booked right prior to us. We said, okay, his Uber's sitting there, let's go get it. So one of us went and got his Uber and called for an Uber, and for whatever reason, the driver came. And we said, no, just come with us. Like we gotta go on a trip. So the driver abandoned Travis to pick up our fare. And this was one of the craziest things, because, we got lucky. He could have been really pissed, and we were like, I'm never going to work with Benchmark. So we take Travis's Uber. He finishes his meeting at that venture firm. He walks out of the office, and his Uber is gone. And so literally, he shows up at our office 10 minutes late, sweating profusely, with his shoelaces untied. He's like a mess. And we look at him, we're like, what happened? He's like, oh, it's good. Everything's cool. And he was a little shaken up, but we let him in on it eventually. When we actually closed the Series A with him, we sent him a pair of Nikes. And I think he figured it out when we sent him the pair of Nikes. So that was probably the most fun and riskiest call ever in doing a Series A with an entrepreneur.
That's amazing.
Yeah. Completely true story. You could ask him about it.
I like that one. That's a good one.
After that, hopefully we've been entirely supportive and helpful to him and the company, rather than causing lots of panic. But you have to ask him and the team about that.
So Snapchat, a lot of people were very dismissive of Snapchat at the beginning. What did you see that was interesting?
Yeah, there's not a ton I can say about it, but Evan is just an incredible product mind and entrepreneur. And I think a lot of the great entrepreneurs had a very specific and different point of view on what needed to be with a new product, and had a real sense of purpose and a real sense of purpose tied to a specific point in time. I think timing is really important for all of these things. And one of the big cliche questions that VCs ask entrepreneurs is, why now? But I actually think it's a really important question. You may have some interesting idea. One of the big cliches in venture is being 5 years too early is the same thing as being wrong. And I think that's absolutely right, because you have to have the right, as I said before, kind of the right angle of attack at the right moment. So early on with Snapchat, the common thing that people were really dismissive of was they said, oh, well, it's about disappearing pictures, it must be for sexting. That's what it's about sexting. And if you look in the media from the early days of Snapchat, that's what people talked about was, people must be using this for sexting. But actually, most of what was going on was teenage girls sending selfies to their friends who were other teenage girls, all day long. And that was just a totally different behavior that nobody else was like, what is this? What are they doing? It was actually, it was a form of communication, and a new form of communication that couldn't really be done any other way through any other product. And I remember when we did the investment, Evan and Bobby were still working out of Evan's dad's living room, dining room, excuse me. They were literally like at his dining room table. There were like 12 people sitting around a dining room table with 12 computer screens, because back then people had computer screens. And I remember he asked, what do you like about this product? And I said, what I like about it is that it, more than anything I've ever seen, it makes you feel like you're physically present with the person, like you're actually there in the same space as them, and it brings a kind of presence and intimacy to technology, which I'd never experienced before. And I think that was like a really powerful emotional thing for a lot of people really early on who were users of the product.
And that resonated with him as well? That's one of the things?
Yeah, I think so.
You guys are selling yourselves as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's right. But like in any situation, when you're hiring somebody or where you're trying to get hired, and the venture entrepreneur thing is like this kind of funny version of hiring and getting hired. Like I'm like an employee at Domo who Josh can't fire. He's kind of stuck with me. So
that's the reminder.
yeah, and he's
very
lost a lot of
careful
sleep
with your
over this.
questions.
Yeah. But that is kind of the dynamic. And just like in any situation where you're hiring somebody or getting hired, it's kind of like a mutual selling process where you're trying to figure each other out and convince each other that you work well together and that it's a good mutual fit. So yeah, that's a big part of it. Is just, can you get into the head of the way that this person sees the world, and do you believe in it? And I think there was like a really specific initial thing that was almost invented there, which of course from there it's grown tremendously into something really important. But that's where it started, and I think that's true for all these things too. You start by unlocking this little problem. Uber was the same thing. It was like this magic thing that came along in San Francisco, provided this new way to actually get around San Francisco without a car or public transit. The big question, by the way, at Uber early on was this only going to work for San Francisco? Because the taxi market was so problematic in San Francisco. It turned out, fortunately, that wasn't the case.
So a lot of press writing about the Snapchat IPO. It's just a small group here. Can you give us some insight into how successful the IPO is going to be and what their financials, like how much flat, no? Okay. So I was curious, when you were talking about some of these deals that you've won and the things that you've said. I mean, I remember my own experience raising money from you guys, and like you said, it's a mutual joint thing.
Yep.
Hopefully. When have you had some experiences where your expression of what you thought about the product, like you mentioned about Snapchat and how it really resonated with you, or something that you did to try to connect with that entrepreneur and stand out, like having Travis run around? Have you done that where it backfired? Any stories about that?
So one of the things about venture is, at least if you're sufficiently neurotic, and I think most of the people who go into venture are pretty neurotic, is you end up being tortured by your failures and what you missed more than by your successes. And I think about Pinterest every day. I think about Airbnb every day. I think about WhatsApp every day. Those were all companies. I hate it when venture capitalists say they passed. You don't get to pass as a venture investor. No entrepreneur has never handed me a signed term sheet and said, please sign here. And I said, no, I'm going to pass. That's not how it works. It's much more organic and biological than that.
But you didn't aggressively seek after.
Exactly. So what VCs should say is, I didn't aggressively seek it out, not I passed. I met with Pinterest, I met with Airbnb, I met with WhatsApp. Did not aggressively pursue any of those companies. And I think there are different reasons in every case, but ultimately...
What was a lesson learned from any of those? Because you probably don't want to talk about all of them necessarily, but if there's one that you could talk about.
Yeah, no, I can talk about all of them. With Pinterest, it was actually the flaw of falling into the trap of exactly what I talked about before, which was I was trying too much to be like a product person or a product thinker. And I was like, this product it's interesting, but I don't really get it. And yeah, the engagement numbers are incredible and the growth is pretty good, but I just don't really get it. And after Pinterest, I thought about just
You're getting old, Matt.
putting this poster up. Well, no, actually, I wasn't old enough at the time. I thought about putting this poster up on the wall in my office, which said, "You are not a 37-year-old American woman." Because I wasn't, it turns out, And so, yeah, I didn't really get the product, but actually a lot of those people did. And again, it's grown, dramatically from that initial point. But I think a lot of the reason why some investors didn't aggressively pursue the Facebook and didn't aggressively pursue Snapchat was they looked at the product and said, "This is stupid." Who cares about a directory of other students in a college? Who cares about this stupid photo sharing thing where pictures disappear? That was kind of my reaction initially to Pinterest. Was like, yeah, who cares about these pin boards? I'm going to use that. That was obviously the wrong reaction.
Obviously.
Yeah. So I still don't have that poster up on my wall, but I'm thinking about it.
Yeah, I'd love to see a copy of that thing. I am not. I mean, it's helpful. Every morning you wake up. I'm not a
It is.
Okay,
It's one of my mantras. Yeah.
So we do have a lot of great companies here in Utah.
Yeah.
I don't know if we haven't had a Facebook-like company emerge. We've got some consumer companies that have done pretty well, a couple $100 million here and there. We've had some B2B companies, that have been worth billions of dollars. But we haven't had one of those just explosive, world-altering. And one thing that I think back on, though, is Ancestry.com had a company called MyFamily.com. I don't know if you're familiar with it or not.
Yep.
But it was, as a consumer, I had that experience, and I knew the founders really well, and I knew a lot of the investors that were investing, and they'd call me and they'd be like, "What do you think about this, My Family?" I'm like, "We used it, it's insane."
Yeah.
It was the first place that my whole family, still today, we're not on Facebook the way we were on this.
Yep.
And because it was just easier to make groups, a little more difficult on Facebook when you update things to check, anyway. But, they had that, and there was nothing like it at the time, and Facebook didn't exist, and then it just kind of blah. They couldn't support, the investors couldn't, and it was the CMGI guys didn't want to continue to support it, and Ancestry was making some good money from the subscriptions, and it just dissipated and turned into nothing. And they could have had it. They had photo sharing, which was the big linchpin for Facebook at the beginning. What happens? How do those things, all the other things that could have been Facebook, Friendster, how do those things, what is there commonality in the misses?
There's so many things that can not go right, which is part of what makes it so hard. I think it's hard to speak to real commonality in the misses. You're right about Friendster. I mean, if Friendster had succeeded, I wouldn't be sitting here today, because the Facebook wouldn't have become what Facebook Inc. has become today if Friendster had been sitting there with a ton of market share. And I think it's very much a case-by-case thing. Sometimes it's just about the product having inherent limitations, and sometimes it's about the people having inherent limitations. But it's usually some combination of limitations to people and limitations to what the product model or business model can do. This is a little wonky, but I don't know that. I think family is a tough thing to make really massive, because on the one hand, it's super important and everybody cares about it.
So their name screwed them up.
Everybody. Sorry?
Their name screwed them up. They got too into just family. They couldn't.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's hard. It's hard if you. I think one of the things which is a common pattern of success with these things, which is really important, is to start with something specific, but to your point, not have it be so specifically hard-coded that you don't leave yourself someplace to go. Like the Facebook could have called itself College Facebook or something, and that probably would have, we would have had to change the name, maybe that would have worked, but that would have inherently limited the company. So I think, a lot of these things that have gotten to be really big, whether it's Uber or Tinder or Snapchat or Instagram or Facebook or LinkedIn or Twitter or what have you, there's usually a network effect involved, or a marketplace effect, which is kind of the same thing. SaaS, you can build really big companies without that, but most of the biggest non-SaaS companies have had some kind of a network effect. And I think family's a tough place to build a network effect because it's important to everybody on the planet, but there's no really compelling reason why, if my family is using one product, that the family of somebody in Ohio or in Pakistan needs to be using that same product that I'm using just because my family uses it. So I think anything which is framed around those really small units without a lot of connection point, there is one bridge across families, which is in-laws. And David Sachs, who's now a pretty well-known entrepreneur in the Valley, had a business at one point called Genie, which was kind of another version of the same thing. And he found that in-laws was kind of the thing that connected all the families together, marriage. But that's tough because it's just like one connecting point. It wasn't really enough to build a network effect. So in that case, I don't know the company really well, but I think there were some inherent limitations to where the product could go.
So you've been in a lot of these companies, investing. You worked at Facebook
And LinkedIn.
and LinkedIn.
Yeah.
But Facebook, it's one of the 5 most successful companies of the last 30 years. I don't know. And so it's still, I think, extremely relevant,
Yeah,
especially when you think about our audience here. We're all in startups. We're all in tech companies. And there had to be some moments in those several years that you were at Facebook where there were some big arguments and discussions about pivotal decisions. And we all have those, and we're facing them every day, and we can go, you can go one of 10 directions. I would love to hear a story about Facebook early on when you guys were thinking through either photos or how to connect or, how closed to keep it or how open to make it.
Yep.
Love to hear some stories about that and how you guys deliberated.
Well, we're going to run out of time soon, so I'll tell you a story about Mark. And it was actually a really pivotal moment for me because it taught me a lot about him, which mattered a lot for me. So one of the few things that I did at the company there and at LinkedIn was to help with fundraising. And when I came into the company, it was really close to raising a round from a non-traditional investor, from a non-venture investor. And when I joined the company, I'd been at LinkedIn prior and I'd helped Reed to raise money at LinkedIn. And so I met a lot of the venture investors in the Valley through that process. When I came into the Facebook, every VC I knew started calling me, like off the hook, like, hey, we got to meet with this company, like, you got to help us get in to have a meeting. I said, Mark, like, have we talked to these people? Like, everybody wants to invest in this company. And he said, no, I don't want to do that. And I was like, well, why not? We're raising money. We got to talk to these people. So he said, okay, fine. So we went and talked to those people. And ultimately, we ended up, as I think people know now, raising a round of venture capital, our first round of venture capital from Excel. And I was talking to Ryan backstage about this, actually. I still remember when Art Patterson, who was one of the kind of founding figures in venture capital and at Excel, wonderful older guy, walked up the stairs into our office, and with each step up the stairs, I could see his jaw dropping like a little bit lower and a little bit lower. He's like, what is this? What is going on here? We were assembling IKEA furniture, and Dustin Moskovitz had misplaced a nail or something and cut his hand, so he was like bleeding, and literally, and I'm putting this piece of furniture together, and there's chaos everywhere, and Art walks up the stairs. He's like, what? Kevin, what have you talked me into? His partner, Kevin Afurzi, had talked him into coming over. Although, in the end, Art was actually one of the big advocates for the investment, which is a whole other story. And ultimately, we did end up taking money from them. And I remember when we went out with the partner at Excel, Jim Breyer, who ended up with the board seat, Mark and Sean Parker and I were there at dinner with Jim to kind of celebrate. We'd shaken hands, although we hadn't completed an investment. And Mark left. This was at the Village Pub in Woodside, if anyone's ever been there. Mark left, got up. It's kind of like the only restaurant in Silicon Valley. Mark got up, went into the bathroom, and 5-10 minutes gone by, and he still hadn't come back. And I just thought to myself, something's wrong. Like, what's going on? So I went into the bathroom just to make sure he was okay, and he was sitting on the floor of the bathroom crying. And I was like, what's going on? What's wrong? And he was like, I can't do this. He's like, I already, had an agreement with somebody else that they were going to be my investor, and this doesn't feel right to me. And I said, okay, go work it out with Jim and with that person. It was Don Graham from the Washington Post who ended up on the board of the company, actually. And they did work it out. But it was a remarkable thing to see in anybody, particularly somebody who was kind of doing this for the first time. And it wasn't really a moment of tension, but it was an important moment for me in kind of understanding who this person's character was. One other that I'll tell you just before we have to wrap up. People probably now remember the newsfeed fiasco that happened in 2006. We launched newsfeed in 2006. It's now kind of the core of this media aggregation strategy for Facebook, which is one of the things that made it such an important company. And Mark had always had this idea in mind from the very beginning, and it took us a while to build it. And we were so excited about it when we built it, and we were so internally focused as a company, as a lot of consumer internet companies are, that we just put up this interstitial modal dialog box on the homepage of the site. It was a site then, not an app. When you went onto the site, which said, hey, great news, now there's this thing called Newsfeed, which is going to aggregate all these stories from your friends. And the only way you could dismiss this dialog box was by clicking on a button that said awesome. It was like, we were just sure that you were going to love this. And so we launched this thing, we're all like, yeah, this is going to be awesome. And we were met with rage, and just complete rage. And we were stunned. And first of all, it was the first moment where I was like, holy cow, this company really matters. Because I always like to say the opposite of love is indifference. Like if people hate something, it really matters. Like they care about it. And people really cared about this. And it turned out that there was this one specific edge case that we hadn't tested for, which was people had the expectation that when they changed their relationship status on Facebook, that they didn't want that broadcast out to everybody who was in their social network. And we hadn't really thought that through. And there was a lesson there in product design, which is a whole other topic around not making your users feel like they've been baited and switched, which we certainly didn't do on purpose, but a lot of people felt like they'd been brought in under one set of rules, and then suddenly there was a new set of rules that they hadn't expected. But there was rage. We got a call from the Palo Alto Police Department, literally, saying, listen, we don't know what this news thing is that you people have done, but you need to make it stop now, because there's a protest rally coming to University Avenue in Palo Alto, and we just do not have the infrastructure to handle that, literally. And this happened. And so there's people protesting newsfeed on the streets of Palo Alto, like this is the Vietnam War. And I remember I was on the phone in my office, and I didn't have an office, in the office in the corner, the meeting room in the corner, and I'm talking on the phone, dealing with, what are we going to do, blah, blah, blah. And as I'm in the middle of the conversation, this camera, arises up from the street, turns and points at me, and I just take the window blind, I'm like, shut it, It was like, that was out of a movie. They should have put that in the freaking movie. There are a lot of people, including some of the company's investors and some of the company's employees, were emailing Mark. We were just kind of, dealing with this 24/7, saying, you got to get rid of it. You got to, this is going to kill the company. You got to take it down. And his reaction to that, has really stayed with me to this day, because he didn't even consider it. It wasn't like, am I going to take this down or not? It was like, of course I'm not taking this down. Like this is the future of the company. Like this is what we're here for. This is what we're building. Like we got to fix some stuff. So we pulled 2 all-nighters in a row, literally. The engineering team worked for almost 48 hours straight to change some of the logic and how it worked around this relationship issue in particular. And the rest was history. But there's always been a real clarity of purpose, which I think defines all the great entrepreneurs, and you have it too. And it's what in a lot of cases separates great from everything else.
Cool. Well, Matt, thanks a lot for being here. It's
My pleasure.
The inaugural Silicon Slopes Tech Summit, kicking it off for us. Everybody.
That's a great event.
Matt Cohler. Thanks so much, bro. That was awesome. Appreciate it.
Fun.